August 1945. The world is exhausted. After 6 years of total war, cities lie in ruins, economies are broken, and millions are already dead. In Europe, the fighting has ended, but in the Pacific, the war rages on with brutal intensity. Every island taken has come at an enormous cost. Every mile forward has been paid for in blood. And now, the United States stands at the edge of a decision unlike any in human history. Inside a guarded room, far from the front lines, a single question hangs in the air. Should the atomic bomb be used? History tells us the answer that was chosen, but tonight we're asking a different question. What if the USA never dropped the atomic bomb? To understand how close the world came to a different timeline, we have to return to the moment before the decision was made, when the future was still uncertain and the order had not yet been given. At this point in the war, Japan is losing. Its navy is shattered, its air force weakened, and its cities devastated by conventional bombing. Yet surrender does not come. Military leaders insist on fighting to the end, believing that resistance, no matter how costly, will secure better terms. For the United States, the outlook is grim. Plans are already underway for Operation Downfall, a full-scale invasion of the Japanese mainland. Military estimates predict catastrophic casualties. Hundreds of thousands of American soldiers could be killed. Millions of Japanese civilians might die in the process. The war could drag on for years. Meanwhile, a new weapon has been completed in secrecy. The Manhattan Project, an unprecedented scientific effort, has produced something the world has never seen before: a single bomb capable of destroying an entire city in seconds. Its power is theoretical, but terrifying. Some see it as the fastest way to end the war. Others see it as a line humanity should never cross. Within the U.S. government, debate is fierce, though mostly hidden from public view. Scientists who helped build the bomb warn of moral consequences. Military planners focus on numbers, projections, probabilities. Politicians weigh not only the war, but the future balance of global power. Because Japan is not the only audience, the Soviet Union is watching. The alliance that defeated Nazi Germany is already beginning to fracture. Mutual suspicion is growing, and the atomic bomb represents more than a weapon. It represents dominance, a signal, a warning. Using it would not just end a war, it would announce a new era. But what if that signal was never sent? What if at the final moment the decision changed? There were alternatives on the table. Some advisors suggested a demonstration, detonating the bomb over an uninhabited area, hoping the sheer display of power would force Japan to surrender. Others argued for modifying surrender terms, allowing Japan to keep its emperor, removing the need for further bloodshed. There were even voices calling for patience, waiting for the Soviet Union's entry into the war against Japan, believing that combined pressure would make surrender inevitable without the use of the bomb. None of these options were guaranteed. All of them carried risk. And in war, leaders are taught to fear uncertainty more than consequence. So imagine a different outcome. Imagine that the order to drop the bomb is delayed. Days pass, then weeks. The weapon exists, but remains unused. In this alternate timeline, the United States chooses restraint, not out of weakness, but caution. The invasion plans continue. Diplomacy intensifies. The world holds its breath, unaware that history is balancing on a knife's edge. Japan, facing mounting pressure and internal collapse, begins to fracture politically. Civilian leaders grow desperate.
Military hardliners resist. The Soviet Union enters the war, attacking Japanese forces in Manchuria with overwhelming force. The shock is immense. Suddenly, Japan faces defeat on all fronts. Without the atomic bomb, surrender becomes slower, but not impossible. It comes through exhaustion rather than annihilation, through negotiation rather than devastation. And when it happens, the world changes in a fundamentally different way. Because something crucial never occurs. The world never sees a city erased in a blinding flash of light. There is no Hiroshima, no Nagasaki, no images burned into global memory of what nuclear weapons can do. The atomic age still begins, but without its opening nightmare. And that absence matters, because fear shapes behavior. In our real history, the atomic bomb instantly redefined war. It created a shared terror so profound that, paradoxically, it prevented future nuclear conflict. The world learned immediately and viscerally what these weapons meant. But in this alternate world, that lesson is delayed. The bomb remains theoretical, its horror unproven, its limits unknown. Nuclear weapons become an idea before they become a memory, and ideas are easier to misuse than memories. As the war ends without a nuclear strike, the United States emerges victorious, but without the overwhelming psychological dominance that followed Hiroshima. The Soviet Union, having seen no demonstration of atomic power, accelerates its own nuclear program with even greater urgency. The Cold War begins, but on different terms. Without the atomic bomb's shadow burned into history, nuclear weapons are not instantly taboo. They are not yet sacred, not yet forbidden. They are simply another category of weapon. Powerful, yes, but untested in the real world. And that raises a terrifying possibility. The first nuclear weapon might not be used in war-ending desperation, but in war-starting confidence. This is the moment where our story truly begins, because the decision not to drop the bomb does not lead to peace, it leads to uncertainty. A world where nuclear weapons exist, but their consequences are not fully understood. A world where restraint delays fear, but does not remove it. In the next part, we'll explore what happens next, how World War II ends without the atomic bomb, how global power shifts, and how close the world comes to a very different kind of nuclear disaster. Because sometimes the most dangerous outcome isn't the decision that was made, it's the one that wasn't.
Without the atomic bomb, the war does not end in a single blinding moment. It drags. By late summer of 1945, Japan is cornered, but not yet broken. Its cities are scarred by firebombing, its supply lines collapsing, its people exhausted. Still, surrender remains politically dangerous. Inside Tokyo, divisions deepen between civilian leaders seeking an end and military hardliners determined to fight on, believing resistance itself is leverage. Across the Pacific, American planners face a grim reality. Operation Downfall, the invasion of Japan, moves from contingency to preparation. Troops are trained, equipment is shipped, hospitals expand. Purple Hearts are manufactured in quantities so large that decades later, many will still remain unused in warehouses. Everyone understands the cost. What no one knows is how high it will be. Then, a seismic shift. In August 1945, the Soviet Union enters the war against Japan, exactly as promised. Red Army forces surge into Manchuria, overwhelming Japanese defenses with speed and scale. The myth of Japan's remaining strength shatters almost overnight. For Japanese leaders, this is a nightmare scenario. They had hoped the Soviets might act as mediators, brokers of a negotiated peace. Instead, they become invaders. the prospect of a divided Japan, occupied by both American and Soviet forces, suddenly feels very real. Fear replaces pride. Behind closed doors, the balance tips. Without the atomic bomb forcing an immediate surrender, Japan's capitulation comes through a convergence of pressures: Soviet invasion, economic collapse, internal dissent, and the unavoidable realization that continued war means national annihilation by attrition. Eventually, the emperor intervenes, not after a nuclear catastrophe, but after a slow, undeniable unraveling. Japan surrenders. World War II ends not with a single defining image, but with a whimper rather than a scream. And that difference echoes far beyond 1945. In this alternate timeline, the absence of nuclear devastation reshapes the post-war world in subtle but profound ways. The United States emerges victorious, but not transformed into an untouchable superpower overnight. The atomic bomb exists, but it has not yet rewritten the psychology of war. There is no shared global trauma, no immediate understanding of just how final nuclear destruction can be. The Soviet Union, meanwhile, claims greater influence in Asia. Its rapid victories against Japanese forces strengthen its bargaining position. Communist movements across the region feel emboldened. The early Cold War begins with a more balanced and more volatile distribution of power. And then there is the bomb itself, still intact, still secret, still unused. For a brief moment in history, humanity possesses the most destructive weapon ever created without fully understanding what it does to cities, to societies, to generations. That ignorance is dangerous. In our real history, Hiroshima and Nagasaki became instant cautionary tales. They shocked the world into fear. They turned nuclear weapons into symbols of ultimate horror, tools to be avoided at almost any cost. But in this world, no such lesson exists. Nuclear weapons are discussed in abstract terms: yield, radius, strategy, deterrence. They are debated in conference rooms and written into doctrines, without images of human consequence to restrain ambition. Military planners begin to see possibilities. What if nuclear weapons could be used tactically? What if a small nuclear strike could end a regional conflict quickly? What if the fear of retaliation is exaggerated? Without precedent, the line between theory and temptation grows thin. By the late 1940s, the nuclear arms race accelerates faster than ever. The Soviet Union tests its own atomic bomb sooner, driven by urgency and suspicion. Britain follows. Others begin quietly laying the groundwork. The bomb spreads, not as a forbidden last resort, but as the next step in military evolution. And the world grows more unstable because of it. Conflicts that once might have remained conventional now carry an unspoken question: why not use the most powerful tool available? This question hangs over early Cold War flashpoints: Berlin, Korea, Taiwan. In this timeline, the restraint that defined nuclear policy in our world is weaker. Leaders have no vivid memory of cities erased in seconds. The taboo is thinner, which means the margin for error is smaller. At the same time, public opinion evolves differently. In our history, anti-nuclear movements draw strength from the visible horror of Hiroshima. In this world, opposition exists, but it's abstract. It lacks the emotional weight that photographs and survivor stories once carried. People fear nuclear weapons, but they don't know them. And fear without understanding is fragile. This creates a paradox. By not dropping the atomic bomb, the United States avoids an immediate moral catastrophe, but risks a future one, a future where nuclear weapons are normalized before their true cost is understood. The irony is unsettling. Restraint delays fear, but delay may increase danger. As the late 1940s turn into the 1950s, the Cold War hardens. Alliances form, ideologies clash, proxy wars ignite, and always in the background sits the unused bomb, its power growing, its presence spreading, its consequences still hypothetical. Until someone, somewhere, decides to test that hypothesis in war. In the next part, we'll explore that terrifying possibility, how a world without Hiroshima might stumble into a nuclear conflict later, not out of desperation, but out of overconfidence. Because the most dangerous weapons are not always the ones that are used first. They're the ones whose limits remain unproven. By the early 1950s, the world has changed, but not in the way anyone expected. The atomic bomb still hasn't been used in war, and that fact, instead of bringing peace, has quietly rewritten the rules of conflict. In this timeline, nuclear weapons are no longer unthinkable. They are untested, and that distinction matters more than anyone realizes. Military doctrines evolve differently. Strategists talk less about mutually assured destruction and more about decisive advantage. Without Hiroshima and Nagasaki as proof of absolute devastation, nuclear weapons are framed as bigger bombs, not civilization-ending events. The danger isn't ignorance, it's overconfidence. Then comes Korea. In 1950, the Korean War erupts just as it did in our history, a brutal proxy conflict between East and West. United Nations forces clash with North Korean and Chinese troops in a grinding, bloody stalemate. But here, the conversation behind closed doors sounds very different. American commanders, frustrated by endless casualties, quietly raise a question that would have been taboo in our timeline. What if we used a nuclear weapon tactically? Not to destroy a city, not to annihilate a population, but to break enemy momentum. A single strike on a remote military target, a demonstration of power. After all, no one truly knows what would happen. That uncertainty becomes the argument. Some believe a nuclear strike would shock the enemy into retreat without triggering full-scale escalation. Others argue that restraint has already failed, that conventional war is bleeding nations dry. The president hesitates. History holds its breath. In the end, the order is delayed, but not rejected. The world comes terrifyingly close to witnessing the first wartime nuclear use, not as a last resort, but as a strategic experiment. And that moment leaves a mark. From that point on, every major conflict carries a shadow. In Europe, tensions around Berlin intensify. In Asia, Taiwan becomes a flashpoint. In the Middle East, newly independent nations find themselves pulled into Cold War gravity. Nuclear weapons are now embedded in military planning, not as symbols of apocalypse, but as tools waiting for justification. And justification is easy to find in war. As arsenals grow, so does bravado. Generals and politicians who never saw a city vanish in seconds convince themselves that escalation can be controlled, that nuclear war can be managed, that lines can be drawn and respected. But history warns us otherwise. Then, in the late 1950s, something breaks. A regional conflict, small by global standards, spirals unexpectedly. Intelligence fails, signals are misread. A commander believes escalation is imminent and chooses to act first. A single nuclear weapon is deployed, not against a capital, not against civilians, but against a military formation. The explosion is smaller than Hiroshima would have been, but the impact is larger. The world finally sees it, the fireball, the shockwave, the radiation sickness that lingers long after the blast, the land rendered unusable, the soldiers who survive,
and wish they hadn't. There is no cheering, no victory parade, only shock, only regret, only the sudden horrifying realization that nuclear weapons are not bigger bombs, they are something else entirely. News spreads fast, photographs leak, footage circulates, survivors speak. Scientists confirm what theorists underestimated: the long-term damage, the invisible poison, the generational consequences. Public opinion flips almost overnight. Protests erupt across continents. Citizens demand limits. Allies question leadership. Neutral nations panic. The nuclear taboo is finally born, but it comes late and at a cost. Now the world understands what it failed to learn in 1945, and understanding breeds fear. The Cold War enters its most dangerous phase, not because leaders want to use nuclear weapons, but because they now know exactly what happens if they do. Arms control talks begin under pressure rather than foresight. Treaties are rushed. Red lines are drawn with shaking hands. Humanity steps back from the brink, but barely. And historians will later argue that this delayed lesson made the nuclear age more unstable, not less. Because instead of one shocking introduction that froze the world in fear, there were years of temptation, followed by a catastrophic wake-up call. A lesson learned late is a lesson paid for in blood. As the decades pass, the question lingers: was avoiding Hiroshima truly the moral victory it seemed? Or did it simply postpone the horror, allowing it to emerge later in a world less prepared, more armed, and dangerously confident? In the final part, we'll confront that question head-on. We'll compare this alternate world to our own and ask whether the unthinkable act of 1945 prevented an even darker future. Because history is not just about what happened, it's about what almost happened and what still might.
History often asks a cruel question. Is it better to commit one undeniable horror or risk many uncertain ones? In this alternate world, where the atomic bomb was never dropped on Japan, that question never stops echoing. By the 1960s, humanity finally understands nuclear weapons, not through foresight, not through wisdom, but through delayed consequence. The first wartime nuclear detonation outside Japan changes everything. What was once theoretical becomes painfully real. Radiation sickness, genetic damage, poisoned land, these are no longer scientific terms, they are lived experiences. And now, fear arrives. But fear arrives late. In our real timeline, the shock of Hiroshima and Nagasaki instantly reframed global politics. Nuclear weapons became symbols of absolute destruction. Leaders who came after 1945 grew up knowing exactly what one bomb could do. In this world, leaders spent years guessing. That delay reshaped the Cold War in dangerous ways. Arms races accelerated faster. Doctrines were written with optimism instead of terror. Near misses multiplied. The world survived not because it was careful, but because it was lucky, very lucky. As archives open decades later, historians uncover chilling truths. Moments when commanders nearly launched nuclear strikes, believing escalation was manageable. Incidents where faulty radar or miscommunication almost triggered catastrophe. The margin for error was thinner here than in our reality. And yet, there is another side to this story: Japan. In this timeline, Japan was never scarred by nuclear fire. No cities were erased in seconds. No generations grew up with the memory of atomic shadows burned into walls. Japan rebuilds differently. Its post-war identity is shaped by defeat, occupation, and recovery, but not nuclear trauma.
The country still embraces pacifism, but without being the sole living witness to atomic horror. As a result, global anti-nuclear movements take longer to find their voice. There is no single nation that can say, "We know what this does." The moral authority that Japan held in our world never fully materializes, and that absence matters, because stories shape conscience. Without Hiroshima, humanity lacks a universal symbol of nuclear evil. Instead of one unforgettable warning, there are scattered, delayed reminders, each learned the hard way. So which world is better? One where nuclear horror arrived early and shocked humanity into restraint? Or one where restraint delayed understanding and allowed temptation to grow? There is no easy answer. In our world, the atomic bomb ended World War II swiftly, but at an unimaginable cost. Hundreds of thousands suffered, entire cities vanished. The moral weight still haunts us. But that horror also froze the nuclear trigger finger. No nuclear weapon has been used in war since 1945. In the alternate world, restraint saved Japan, but risked everyone else. Nuclear weapons lingered in ambiguity, inviting experimentation. The taboo formed later, weaker and under pressure. The lesson, it seems, is painfully human. We often learn fastest through catastrophe. But learning through catastrophe doesn't make catastrophe right. History does not offer clean victories, only trade-offs, and the atomic bomb is the ultimate example. Today, as nuclear arsenals still exist, as tensions rise and fall, this question remains deeply relevant. Is fear the guardian of peace, or is wisdom supposed to come before fear? If the USA had never dropped the atomic bomb, the world might look more moral on the surface, but more dangerous underneath. Or perhaps, humanity would have found another way to learn. That is the unsettling truth of alternate history. It doesn't tell us what should have happened. It forces us to confront what could happen again. Because the real warning of Hiroshima may not be about the past at all. It may be about the future and whether we remember the cost of forgetting. If this story made you think, question history, or see the world differently, make sure to hit the like button. It really helps this video reach more curious minds. Subscribe to DecisioVault for more deep, untold what-if stories that history never answers directly. And turn on the notification bell, because the next decision we uncover might change how you see the world forever. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Do you think the world would be safer or more dangerous without Hiroshima? Let's discuss.